Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second lecture of the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History 2023-2024. To enhance cultural exchange and academic research, the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History was established in 2007 and co-organized by the College and the Department of History of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Austin Eminence Charitable Foundation for sponsoring this year's lecture. In addition, the Hong Kong Museum of History is the co-organizer of today's lecture. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the museum for providing the venue and assisting in promoting the lecture. This year, we are honored to have Professor Michael Puett, Watersey Klein Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology, Harvard University, as our speaker. The topic of today's lecture is Culture and History, Yu Ying-shih, Weber, and Approaches to Comparative History. And it will be moderated by Professor Puett, Associate Professor, Department of History, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. The lecture will now begin. May I invite Professor Michael Puett and Professor Puett to come to the stage. Professor Puett and Professor Puett, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History series. So may I introduce Professor Michael Puett. Professor Michael Puett is the Walter C. Klein Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology at Harvard University. His interests are focused on the interrelations between religion, philosophy, anthropology, and history, with the hope of bringing the study of China into larger historical and comparative frameworks. He is author of many books and articles, so I won't bother to read them out. You will find them in the internet. 以下我会简短的介绍Professor Michael Puett 的背景。他是哈佛大学Walter C. Klein 教授，是中国历史及人类学教授。那么他的这个研究的兴趣是这个宗教、哲学、人类学和历史的互相关系。希望把中国研究放在一个更广阔的历史的和比较的脉络之中。他的著作非常多我现在就不这个浪费时间介绍他的著作了，因为大家都可以在网上可以搜到的。那么今天他的讲座的这个内容是文化与历史、余英时、韦伯和比较史学方法。Today, Professor Michael Puett will deliver a lecture on culture and history, Yu Ying-shih, Weber, and approaches to comparative history. Professor Puett.
Thank you. So it is my deep honor to be here today to discuss with you some of the most exciting ideas that Yu Ying-shih has been bringing to our attention. To do so, let me begin with a huge note of gratitude to Chinese University of Hong Kong for their support for the Yu Ying-shih lectures in general, and more specifically for inviting me to deliver them this year. This is a tremendous honor, and my tremendous gratitude as well to Professor Puett for the much too nice introduction, but very, very deeply appreciated. Oh, and should I move this a little bit closer? Absolutely. How's that? Is that good? Good. I can also move it right in front. Is that better? Is that good? Okay, good. So my deep thanks to all of you. Now, what I would like to do today is to discuss with you one of the most significant and hotly debated topics of literally the past 2 centuries, namely the global rise of capitalism and how we can understand this. But let me stop for a second. Actually, I'm even using this, so if you'd like, we can. It'd be easier to even move this all together. Is that good? Yep. Oh, you need it for that. Exactly. How's that? Is that good? Yep. I'll say a few words as we work on the sound levels. Is that good? Great. Is that good? Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. So what I will be speaking about today is one of the most hotly debated topics of literally the past 2 centuries, namely, how do we understand the emergence of capitalism, and particularly, how do we understand it from a global perspective? To introduce this, let me begin about 2 centuries ago when this debate began, which, as we will see, occurs in Europe for reasons that we'll be mentioning, and how people in Europe were conceptualizing the emergence of capitalism, which they did not think was a global phenomenon. I will then turn to arguably the single most influential figure. We'll then be moving into the early 20th century, a figure called Max Weber, who set out one of the most powerful visions for how to think of the rise of capitalism. And then I will, of course, turn to Yu Ying-shih, the figure whose work has been so extraordinarily important, leading to this lecture series. And Yu Ying-shih is responding to Max Weber, making a larger argument about where he was right, where he was wrong, and more importantly, how we need to rethink this question from a larger global perspective, in his case, of course, most definitely including China. So to set all of this up, let me again jump back 200 years ago to when this debate began. So when the debate began, it's the 19th century now in Europe, when people at the time, foolishly, I would say in retrospect, thought that the emergence of not just capitalism, but what they like to call modernity was an exclusively Western development. The full argument went along the following lines. The claim was, and it's amazing even now to think that humans could have thought such a thing, but this was the standard view, that all of humanity somehow for the past several 100,000 years lived in something that was called a traditional society. In those traditional societies, everyone's way of life was predefined for them. So you would be born into a pre-given social position. You would be born into a religious worldview. You would be born into a world of predefined roles, none of which you had any choice over, none of which you could change in any way. And where you were born, therefore, would determine your entire life. The claim was somehow all of humanity lived in such traditional societies until, in Europe, you had the breakthrough to what was called modernity, where the claim went, humans for the first time could change all that I just mentioned. Humans for the first time were able to, for themselves, decide what to believe, what religious ideas to support or not, how they wanted to live their lives, whether they were happy with the roles they were born into, or whether those roles should be changed, whether they were happy with the larger social order they were born into, or whether that social order should be changed as well, and whether or not they were happy living the life economically and financially they were born into, meaning from this narrative, they would have the ability on their own to gain and accumulate wealth, and therefore be able to have the financial power to make all of the changes I just mentioned. The claim again was that somehow this was a unique development in 19th century Europe. Now, as I can rest assured, I see in your eyes the horror that people would think such a thing. But let me explain immediately both why they did it in terms of an understandable way, is also why they did it in an infuriating way. So the understandable part behind this narrative is European thinkers in the 19th century were, of course, looking back to 18th century. And in 18th century Europe, I won't say that the stereotypes of a traditional society were completely accurate, but nonetheless, generally speaking, if you're in the 19th century of Europe, you're looking back in the 18th century, the vision I gave is not completely right. I mean, it was a world where most of your life would be predefined at birth. You would be born into a social status, you would be born into a social rank, and there was very, very little social mobility. So generally speaking, you can see why there would be this view that they saw before them a traditional world, and certainly in 19th century Europe, they were seeing a world dramatically changing, literally on a decade-by-decade basis. That's the understandable part of where this narrative comes from. Now, there's also a horrible part of this narrative that I should mention as well, because along with the claim that they, the Europeans, had broken from this traditional world, they also were at that very moment engaged in an extraordinary imperial expansion over the rest of the globe. And part of the traditional modernity narrative was a legitimation of that imperialism. The claim was the rest of the world is still mired in these traditional societies, and we are liberating them by taking them over. And once we take them over, we will allow them, we will help them, guide them even into the modern world that we are now creating in Europe. So there's both an understandable side to this narrative as well as a horrifying side to this narrative. Now, before I get to a further discussion of it, let me give you a few examples of how this narrative operated in practice, because this will be important for how figures like Yu Ying-shih will be responding to it. So two of the dominant ways of building these modernity narratives, particularly involving things like, we will finally get to capitalism, involve the following sets of claims. One of these was the view that there was some kind of an inherent teleological development leading to modernity. And teleology here is a word specifically meaning a telos, a final goal of history. The view would be that modernity was that final goal, and that all of what had been happening before in these traditional societies was moving toward this final moment of modernity. And for many thinkers, that final moment, at least in the economic world, involved capitalism. Capitalism, according to this view, would be an organization of the world that allowed individuals to accumulate wealth on their own initiative, as opposed to being determined by whether or not they happen to be born into a position of rank or not. So capitalism was one of those final moments. The other aspects of modernity are equally important. Part of the claim was science was an inherent part of modernity. So the view here was that in distant antiquity, people foolishly believed in things like magic. Then eventually they evolved to a higher stage where they had a belief in things like world religions, which weren't based upon magic, but were still based upon religious beliefs. And then the next stage would be a secularized society based upon a scientific understanding of the world. So economically, the final result is capitalism. In terms of things like an understanding of the world, you shift from religion to a secularized science. And yet another piece of it was the political world. The claim was in distant antiquity, people just accepted forms of authority, like, for example, hereditary monarchy, because they couldn't question that. And in a modern society, humans on their own can determine how to organize the political world. So all of these were seen as teleological developments leading up to this moment of modernity. And I might add, even the major critics of the day in Europe largely accepted this narrative. So to give an obvious example, Karl Marx would say, well, no, the teleology is not capitalism. The teleology is a communist world to come. And yet, at least in the Marxist narrative, the only way you can achieve communism was to go through capitalism. So in his view, there were these inherent sets of stages you must go through in order to reach that final telos. And Marx just said, there's yet another one still to come. So in this narrative, the final teleological development would be modernity in some manner, shape, or form. And again, in most of the thinkers, capitalism was the economic moment of that realization for the modern world. There's one other side of this that I would also like to mention, because it will be important for Yu Ying-shih's critique, which would say, along with this teleological development toward modernity, there was another specific aspect of this in terms of capitalism, which held that it's not just that it's a progressive growth from the traditional world, that capitalism should be thought of as sort of wiping away the traditional world. And this was a view particularly important among a number of liberal economists who made the following argument, that in primitive society, actually, the beginnings of a market simply emerged when people began to realize that if they had an extra surplus of something, say a little bit extra grain, they could give that to someone who needed it. That person who needed it could in return barter something that I need. So if I needed some metal, I could get some metal back for grain I would be giving. And so a barter exchange system was seen as an early natural development in which movements of goods would occur naturally. And the traditional world, according to this view, was a world that stopped this, right? The traditional world would be one in which you had powerful authorities emerging, politically, religiously, that would predetermine what could or could not be exchanged, and hence leading to, as we mentioned before, this traditional world where everything was being controlled by traditional authorities. And capitalism would then be seen as the moment when those traditional authorities would be wiped out and individuals again could begin bartering. Only now it wouldn't just be bartering with someone they happen to be a neighbor with. Now it would be bartering with anyone over huge distances because we had the proper creation of things like money. And so the implication would be capitalism is what happens when you wipe away these traditional authorities and allow people to freely do what they otherwise would be doing economically, which is simply transferring goods to each other. And so in this narrative, modernity isn't simply a high development of the modern world, it actually is a kind of wiping away of traditional authority, allowing a proper capitalist world to develop. So it is not only a higher development, it is in a certain sense a kind of natural development once we get rid of all of these traditional authorities. Now, these views continue to be dominant for much of the 19th century, hotly debated. As you can already see, there are some debates among ways of thinking about capitalism, even the examples I've mentioned, but they're all largely accepting this general progressivist view. Then we move into the early 20th century. And we turn to the figure who in many ways would be the single most influential figure to discuss all of these issues, Max Weber, who at one level will accept pieces of what I've just mentioned, but he will also make some significant alterations in ways that will be incredibly influential. So Max Weber is again writing in the early 20th century. He does, generally speaking, accept a modernity narrative. So he will use terms like traditional authority, and he certainly will use terms like modernity, and we will see he most certainly will use terms like capitalism. But in Weber's framework, there is, number one, no inherent set of stages that you go through, nor will he accept the idea that capitalism is somehow a natural way for humans to interact once we wipe away traditional authorities. So Weber's argument, on the contrary, will go along the following lines. One of the key terms for Weber will be what he calls rationalization. And he will argue that what 19th century evolutionary theory was discussing should be thought of as rationalization. So to give one of my earlier examples, he will accept, generally speaking, a narrative that would take you from primitive magic to world religions to a secular scientific understanding. His term for that will be rationalization. It is humans coming to rationally understand the world in means and mechanisms that allow them to work with and manipulate the world. So they're trying to manipulate it with what he would call magic. That is largely taken away in religious worldviews. And in a scientific worldview, you realize The natural world is simply sets of resources that we humans can manipulate for our own benefit. Similarly, he will argue, in the political sphere, think of the development we've been talking about, again, as rationalization. So, traditional authority for Weber would mean authority that was not rationally decided upon. So figures would be granted authority, again, sticking with your example, an hereditary monarch would have traditional authority because they would be understood to be inherently better than the rest of us because of birth. And once you get a rational society developing, then you will get what ought to be thought of as political problems, thought of as simply political means and rationality problems. How do we organize the society successfully? How do we build a legal code successfully? All that would be debated and determined by rational means. And getting to our big example, capitalism, he would argue here too, think of it as rationalization, which means it's not simply a natural way for humans to interact in the world. It involves a rationalization, which he would say means you don't have systems of exchange based upon traditional forms of authority. You do have capitalism being thought of as means, ends, rationality. So we are undertaking economic activity simply to accomplish certain ends. But this for him is not natural. It is, in fact, a rational process, meaning that you must ask, how do you achieve and for him, this is a kind of surprising, a view that rationally we should organize an economic system this way. And for him, this not only does not mean you're wiping away traditional authority, for Weber, you're actually creating a significant body of rational systems of institutions that allow capitalism to exist. So you need a strong state, you need a legal code, you need all forms of institutions that will allow you to rationally organize the world to allow capitalism to develop. All of which means that for Weber, there is nothing inherent or natural about a process of rationalization. So at one level, it is in a certain sense a progressivist narrative, right? The final stage is still going to be a rational modern world, but there's nothing inherent about it. It's not that every society will necessarily inherently rationalize, nor is it a sense that you're simply wiping away traditional authority and this would be the natural result of what happens once that traditional authority is gone. Now, all of this, I'm sure, sounds incredibly abstract, so let me get to the crucial question. Why does all of this matter? Why does this matter for Weber, and why does it matter for our understandings? Here finally is why this matters. Because once Weber has made the moves he's made, it suddenly means he is going to ask a series of questions, which is, if this is not an inherent development, either an inherent teleological development or an inherent development in the sense of just, once you wipe away traditional authority, of course you get capitalism, it means he is going to pose the question of, why then do you get the emergence of capitalism in Europe, which for him is not a pre-given fact. It is a surprising fact. And the other key thing about Weber, very much unlike most of the 19th century thinkers, is Weber is at least going to attempt to pose this in terms of a global perspective. So Weber himself only knows European languages, but at least he, unlike most of his contemporaries, and certainly unlike most of the figures in the 19th century dealing with this question, he is going to take the time to actually read translation, but still read texts from around the world, read intensively historical writings from around the world, only what he has access to in European languages, but still, he is going to try to read world history, and he is going to try to pose the following question. Not just, as I mentioned before, why does capitalism emerge in Europe? But equally importantly for him, why does it not emerge anywhere else? In other words, what are the unique confluence of factors that lead to the emergence of capitalism in one part of the world, and why does it not occur in others? And when he poses this question, for Weber, the big other, bar none, is China. And the reason is, for Weber at least, very simple. According to these models of rationalization that he's developing, China, for Weber, is the weird place. We'll see, in a kind of good way, because he will say China is the place that rationalizes incomparably earlier than any other society, absolutely earlier than the West. So in China, Weber will argue, you get a not quite modern, but nonetheless very rationalized bureaucracy 2,000 years ago, literally about 2,000 years before you see it anywhere else in the world, certainly before you see it in Europe. You get administrative states developing 2,000 years ago, the likes of which you will not see in Europe until the 19th century. And so you get this incredibly early development of a highly rationalized political system. You also get an incredibly rationalized religious view. And I put that in an odd tone of voice for reasons that will become clear momentarily when I get into his details of what he's thinking about. But you don't get the emergence of capitalism. And on the contrary, where do you find capitalism emerging? And of all places, Europe, which he, unlike a lot of the previous 19th century thinkers, he knew enough of world history to realize was a kind of a backwards place for much of world history. I mean, Europe was a place that had, all these definitions of a traditional society were true through the 18th century. So it did not have significant bureaucratic states. It did not have significant administrative policies. It had very few legal systems that cut across aristocratically controlled areas. This didn't really change until the 19th century. And yet, capitalism develops there as opposed to China. So, for Weber, the big comparative question is why Europe and why not elsewhere? But again, the big sort of underlying question there is, and why in the world not China? So, with that as his big question, let's get to his answers that will prove to be incredibly influential, and even among his strong critics, as we will see with Yu Ying-shih, who thinks Weber is wrong, but on to something helpful. So, what are Weber's answers? So, to answer this, let me begin with China and then turn to Europe. So, with China, as we have seen, Weber will argue, powerful from a comparative perspective because of this incredibly early rationalization of the political process, not quite reaching for Weber a purely modern form of rationality, but incredibly close, and again, beginning 2,000 years ago. Also, putting a little bit more meat to something I mentioned very much in passing, he thinks in China too, you have this incredibly rationalized, again, not to the point of a purely modern worldview, but incredibly high philosophical understanding of the world that gets very close. And his big example here is Confucianism. And Weber will argue Confucianism is this amazing system of thinking that, like the bureaucratic system, and he sees correctly the two as being interrelated at certain points in history, is not quite modern, but unbelievably close, and again, developing incredibly early by world historical standards. And what interests him in particular about Confucianism is Weber will say, oh my gosh, here you have a system that is based upon self-cultivation. So individuals cultivate themselves. They are expected to be incredibly disciplined and hardworking in that cultivation process. They are expected to be highly educated because education is seen as inherently part of that cultivation process. So only through education can we as individuals become what we are capable of becoming. However, although I use the term individuals, part of the power for Weber is the goal isn't to be simply a self-cultivated individual, because if you are so being educated, you become less selfish and you become more committed from a Confucian point of view toward creating a social order where people can flourish. And of course, much of your work is expected to be devoted toward creating that social world, to the point where, as Weber notes quite correctly, a significant number of self-proclaimed Confucians will join the bureaucracy and actively try to work to create a workable social order, to the point where, and Weber just found this phenomenal, by the 12th century, you actually have bureaucratic states which are defined significantly only by taking a civil service exam to gain placement in the bureaucracy, meaning that China incredibly early creates, in part because of its Confucian understandings of the world, it creates a political system that's governed not by an hereditary elite, which again was true in Europe through, well, at least the 19th century and arguably well after that too. And here you get in China a society actually run by an educated elite as opposed to an hereditary elite. I mean, for Weber, this is just stunning from an historical perspective. So a Confucian philosophy aimed at self-cultivation, education, building a social order with a resulting political system based upon meritocracy and the creation of an educated elite trained through these Confucian ideas to govern. Again, for Weber, this is extraordinary. But it had another element that for Weber was kind of negative, but you'll see momentarily why I'm using that odd tone of voice. So Weber also claimed, now Yu Ying-shih is going to strongly disagree with this, but this is Weber's view. Weber will also claim that Confucianism, for all of what I just mentioned, creating this sense that we should become educated to work on behalf of creating a better social world, Weber also claimed that Confucianism also ultimately limited the degree to which one would do this, because it would teach one that the world is already harmonious. We as humans, when we're building a proper social order, if we're doing it successfully, it just means we are creating on Earth a perfect harmony that matches the cosmic harmony. And if we do this well, it means we will be living happily within a harmonious cosmos, which means, yes, it's all about education and self-cultivation and creating a social order, but it's not going that next step of saying, and then we as humans should see the world as simply natural resources that we should use and manipulate for our benefit. Because the sense was, no, the world is a harmonious cosmic entity that we should learn to live within. So according to Weber, Confucianism still has a remnant of an earlier magical worldview where the cosmos was seen as an inherently wonderful magical entity that we shouldn't simply see as resources for our utilization. Now, I mentioned there's a negative side to this for Weber, because Weber, for reasons that are now, I'm sure, obvious, would say, well, a purely modern rational worldview would see the world as nothing but resources for our use and manipulation. That's all it is. And a magical worldview would limit the degree to which, of course, we would see a tree as simply something we can cut down for wood, or a mountain is something we can simply take apart for coal. If it's a magical worldview, that would limit our ability, by definition, to so manipulate it. So for Weber, this is a ultimately less rational perspective because Confucianism, according to him, still kept enough of the old magical worldview that it limited the degree to which we could manipulate that natural world. Now, it's negative because it therefore prevented the Chinese, even through Confucianism, for all of the good things I've mentioned, from breaking into a purely modern world. But here we get to something that's going to be very important for Weber, and we'll see very important in a very intriguing way for Yu Ying-shih as well when he critiques this. Weber is an incredibly conflicted, ambivalent figure, to put it mildly. So I just mentioned all of what I just said about a magical worldview that he thinks is part of Confucianism, ultimately holding back China from creating a purely rational system that would simply manipulate the world for human use. Yes, for him, that's a limitation. It is very clear when you read Weber that there's a certain side to him that thinks, isn't this wonderful? I think there's a certain side to Weber that he kind of wishes he was an imperial bureaucrat living in a world that he thought was harmonious, that he thought that he was completely interconnected with, that he did not think of in purely rational means. He kind of loves the Confucian worldview as he describes it. Not purely rational, but there's clearly something, a kind of romantic side to Weber of thinking, wouldn't it be amazing to be able to live in such a world at one level so rational, so meritocratic, such a successful bureaucratic system, and yet still believing you're part of this harmonious cosmos that you're not simply thinking of as this disenchanted material stuff that we can manipulate for our own use. So Weber ultimately thinks China is held back by Confucianism. It takes humanity in China to this incredibly rational level, not quite breaking through, and yet at some level, Weber thinks, what a great place to have lived in. If only I could have been born there. Now, the reason I emphasize all of this is let's then turn to what Weber thinks about Europe. And it's a very counterintuitive reading, especially given all that we have seen from the earlier 19th century European thinkers who consistently put modernity and capitalism as either the highest stage of development or, with Marx, just higher than everything that's come before, even if there's something still to come beyond that. So this ambivalence of this greatness of China is intriguing in itself, and all the more so when we get to why capitalism for Weber emerges, again, he thought, uniquely in Europe. So Weber is a complicated thinker, again, as we've already begun to see, and he thinks there are many reasons why capitalism develops. So he will talk about all the various economic reasons in terms of what's shifting over the previous few centuries. He will talk about the political sets of shifts that make this possible. But by far the most influential argument he will give is when he turns to the cultural side. And this is put together in a book, which has become not only his most influential book, but one of the most, and correctly so, widely read books on the emergence of capitalism, called The Protestant Spirit. It is about how Protestantism, of all things, will help to lead to the emergence of capitalism. Now, as with many influential books, the ideas behind this have become part of a common currency more often than his actual arguments have been read. And so let me take you through a few of the arguments because they're very counterintuitive. And yet we'll see when we get to Yu Ying-shih, it's the counterintuitive sides that most excites him and most intrigue him. So let's turn to Weber's argument about the cultural dimensions that lead to the emergence of capitalism. So again, to underline a few of the key points for Weber, there's nothing inherent about the rise of capitalism. And so you're looking for what sets of things happened, even unrelated to what we know will happen later, he thinks, with the rise of capitalism, but nonetheless helped propel things toward this path. And since we know where we're going with Weber's narrative, like we have to get to a world that is disenchanted, secularized, humans thinking of the world simply as material resources for their own manipulation, and yet humans like doing so with this aggressive work ethic. Where in the world does such a thing come from? Which again, for Weber is a serious question because it's not natural. There's nothing natural about the fact that we think this way. And when I say not natural, boy, does he mean it. So let me now get to his argument. So when he talks about Protestantism, it's important to note immediately, he's really not talking about Protestantism. He's actually talking about one movement called Calvinism. And Calvinism was not a hugely popular movement, but that's okay for Weber's argument. Weber's argument is simply that once these ideas start setting in Europe, they are taken over by even people who are not actively Calvinists. So these ideas become a common currency in Europe. So let me take you through some of, at least as Weber interprets them, Calvinist theology. Very counterintuitive. So in Calvinist theology, whether or not you will spend all of eternity in heaven or hell is predestined by God, a higher deity. God, before you were born, has already decided if you will spend all of eternity in hell or all of eternity in heaven. There is nothing you can do to affect that. Meaning, if you think, okay, if I live my life really well, helping everyone around me, and I'm a moral person, that will help me get to heaven, which is certainly a view that many Christians held. Calvin explicitly opposes this. According to Calvin, no, that's hubris. If I think I, out of my own behavior, can determine where I will be for all of eternity, I think I control something that only God can determine. So I have no control over it. Note immediately for Weber the difference of this with Confucianism. In Confucianism, it's all about the degree to which I educate myself, cultivate myself, become educated, in meaning for him, able to work on behalf of the social world. If I become a bureaucrat, if I can take the civil service exam, become a successful bureaucrat working on behalf of the world, that is what it means to be a successful Confucian. It's all about what I do in this world. According to Calvinism, no. I mean, you can do all of that, we'll see, but that won't do anything to help you get to heaven. Now, in such a worldview, you might think, well, I would just do nothing, right? I'm predestined. Like I said, why bother? Why not just live life as happily as I can? Because, if I'm going to hell, I might as well enjoy life for a few decades first. And if I'm going to heaven, then that's great. And since what I do can't affect that, why should I bother to work hard in this life for anything more? However, according to Weber, the way Calvinism works psychologically is the exact opposite way. Because I think I can't control it, and because I deeply fear the very realistic possibility that I may be consigned to hell for all of eternity, what it creates is this incredibly destabilizing psychological worldview where I become unbelievably focused on working all the time, but not for an immediate gain. Like, I'm not working to become a good person because I'll get to heaven. I'm also not, by the way, working so I can be successful in the social world, or as we will see momentarily, successful economically, because that would be not helping. So why do I work all the time? Because I'm so psychologically destabilized by this theology that I will, simply by working all the time, miserably, hating my life, accomplishing, even when I'm accomplishing things, not caring about it. And if I continue this all of my life, it will create a psychological sense that surely I must be among the elect who will get to go to heaven, because only an elect who would get to go to heaven would be living their life this way. And so it's not that I think because I'm working hard, I'll get to heaven. It's that I must work unbelievably hard all the time beyond any, and this is going to be important, beyond any rational reason for doing so, simply because psychologically I will think this must mean that God predestined me for it to be the elect, because look at what I'm doing with my life. Which means that according to Weber's reading of a Calvinist theology, you're working all the time without any possible reason for doing so or endpoint, right? It would not be the case that you're going to work hard until you make a good living and then you can kick back, because no, that probably means you're going to be in hell, because if you're kicking back, you must not be a predestined good person. So even if you're incredibly successful, you're still going to keep working all the time with this madcap pace, simply because you think that must mean you're part of the elect. This, for Weber, becomes a key factor in the emergence of capitalism. Why? Because he thinks for all of the political, legal, and economic reasons that lead to the emergence of capitalism in Europe, that he devotes huge numbers of pages to in his other writings, he thinks the cultural side is this utterly, and I will use the word intentionally, utterly irrational, insane work ethic without any possible rational justification. And he thinks this is going to be crucial for the rise of capitalism. Because if I simply try to work hard to make a good living for my family, I don't have to work that hard, right? I just have to work enough to get enough money. No, he thinks the capitalist drive is this insane work ethic that you can never stop. Even when you reach a sufficient level of what you think is all that you need to be happy, or all that you need for your family to be happy, it doesn't matter. You keep going. And for him, that's what creates this inherent drive of, insane for him, European forms of capitalism, and an absolutely irrational work ethic. And if that sounds bad, Weber thinks it gets worse. Because at least in Calvinism, if you're lucky to be right about this, and you are working all the time because you are a member of the elect, it means at least you do get to spend your life in eternity in heaven. Then what happens with Calvinism is once this work ethic sets in, it continues even without a belief in heaven. It continues in a secularized form too, meaning that we will work all the time at this insane, irrational pace without any justification or good thing awaiting us for our work. When we do this, it means we create what he will call an iron cage of modernity. An iron cage, meaning we become encaged in our own insane work ethic for absolutely no reason, constantly working and working and working, simply with a pure means and rationality, with no larger goal, which also means there's no limit. I'm not limited by a magical worldview that I'm living in a good cosmos. I'm not even limited by a rational sense of a limit of what would be rationally helpful for society to achieve, or rationally helpful for me to achieve economically. It's rather this iron cage, because it's endless work, endlessly manipulating everything to endlessly accumulate more and more and more with no sense of any possible limit. This, for Weber, is the religious worldview that in a secularized form leads to the emergence of capitalism. Now, it's, I'm sure, immediately obvious what he is doing vis-a-vis all of these 19th century European modes of thinking. Basically, what Weber is saying is, you are foolishly thinking that capitalism is some kind of inherent evolutionary development leading to the best world for all humanity, or in the liberal economic view, the most natural way for humans to interact. And Weber is saying, no, it is this absolutely psychologically destabilizing world that has no possible limit. Now, you might then think, okay, so Weber is a critic of capitalism, right? I mean, sounds pretty bleak that we would ever be living our lives this way. As I mentioned, Weber is a complicated figure, and here we get to one of the most intriguing aspects, and something that will be, again, very important for Yu Ying-shih's critique. Weber will nonetheless say, despite everything I've mentioned, that nonetheless, once you've made this break into the rational world, you have to stay there. And he has these passages where he'll say things like, we must live in the rational world. Now that we're modern, we must live in this. And then he'll say, well, some people maybe can't take it and they'll go off to their churches, but that's just because they're weak and we must do this. And meanwhile, doing this means continuing living in this horrible world, this iron cage. And I might add, this was not an abstract way of thinking for Weber. Weber lived these contradictions. He was both brilliant, also had lots of psychological issues, was constantly having mental breakdowns. This was not a happy man. It's obviously when he's describing this world of the iron cage, he felt he was living it. He was living this insane work drive that made no sense. He hated it. He was trying to understand why he was doing it. He felt he couldn't stop it. And yet it was literally like destroying him mentally. And he felt he was a typical example of a rational figure, which also there helps to explain that bizarre romantic picture he is going to be giving of China. He doesn't feel, as someone who's on the other side, a rational modern figure, he doesn't feel he can literally live in that Chinese worldview, even if he had a time machine. Like he thinks that would be the equivalent of, as he says, those people who can't take it. And yet you're now getting a sense as to why it is that he has these ambivalent feelings about China. In his reading of China, you kind of get the best of a rational world, and precisely because it doesn't cross over, the fact that you still get this magical religious worldview that limits the degree to which we can manipulate the world, it gives us this sense that we're part of a larger good order as opposed to a disenchanted world that we use for our own purposes. The fact that there is clearly a goal in life, the goal being to create a harmonious social order as opposed to this irrational, endless work drive. To him, a Confucian way of thinking, as he describes it, is kind of the best of all worlds. But again, he won't allow himself to say, and therefore, let's create it, because in his view, well, it is a magical worldview. Like it's not right. It's not rational. The cosmos isn't harmonious. It's a bunch of natural materials out there that we're going to manipulate endlessly with no reason, because we have this insane work drive. And until we destroy the world, we'll keep doing it. And it's ridiculous, but that's the modern world. So you get a sense immediately of his incredible ambivalence, both at one level supporting capitalism, and yet at another level, he's an incredible critic of it. And again, China is, for all the reasons now you're getting a sense, the big other for him. So this becomes, I think it is safe to say, the single most influential figure discussing the emergence of capitalism. That reading will become incredibly influential for all sorts of reasons, but the most obvious reason is the clear one, which is he clearly gets something right about the psychological mindset of this incredible work drive that we have, this incredible sense of what he will call disenchantment, where the world is nothing but natural resources for our utilization, this sense that we can't really control our endless manipulation of the natural world, even though we see, painfully, obviously, the dangers of it, and yet we can't stop. He captures something about this bizarre drive that 19th century figures would call modernity, and he'll use the same term, but he captures something of the horrors of it that the 19th century thinkers, by definition, were committed to denying because it for them was either the more natural system or the teleologically highest system. So Weber becomes arguably the most influential figure for discussing capitalism. This book, even though intriguingly not often read by people, nonetheless becomes by far the most important book. I mean, everyone talks about it, even if they've never read it, because again, at a certain level, he's onto something. That was a century ago. Then a few things have happened, needless to say. Well, a lot of things have happened, a few things for our narrative of significance. So the whole claim that was underlying Weber and that he was building upon for a century of previous thinkers in Europe clearly has problems. So Weber and everyone through the 19th century before him in Europe took for granted that it was an empirical fact that capitalism and what they called modernity in general was a unique development in Europe, and hence all of the endless questions, why Europe and why nowhere else? Then some problems occurred for the theory, I mean. If that's the case, why then do you have this explosion of economic activity that if we're going to use the term capitalism, we can certainly happily call capitalism over the past century in Asia? There doesn't seem to be something terribly limiting about whatever you would want to call Asian cultures that prevents the emergence of capitalism. That doesn't seem to be a problem. Then, historically, you have an even arguably bigger problem, at least in terms of this thesis, which is that Weber, and certainly this was even more so for the 19th century figures that preceded him, they knew nothing about the rest of the world, to be perfectly honest. I mean, that's why they could say the rest of the world was traditional, because they knew nothing about it. And Weber at least was trying to read about the rest of the world, but only with what was available in European languages, which was pretty limited and certainly written from a very strict ideological perspective. No historian today, I think that's safe to say, would accept any of the views that were dominant in the 19th century right through Weber's day. The whole argument that you don't have market economies in the world until they develop in Europe in the 19th century is just silly. I mean, to give the obvious example that will be important for where we're going, China had a flourishing market economy for centuries prior to the emergence of 19th century capitalism. I don't think whether or not we want to call that capitalism depends entirely on how we define capitalism, and that's a topic of debate, but it's certainly a flourishing market economy. And pushing back further, you have extraordinary trade routes emanating, including, but also emanating from China, that again, Europe does not join until incredibly late. And in fact, one of the factors leading to the emergence of European imperialism was a self-conscious attempt by these states in the far northwest of Eurasia to try to gain access to these flourishing trade routes that, for geographical reasons, as well as all the other reasons we've been mentioning, Europe was completely removed from. So to say that Europe is somehow the driver of the economic engine of Eurasia is literally wrong. I mean, the driver is the rest of Eurasia, and Europe is the very, very, very latecomer to it. And it's very intriguing historically why, when it enters late, it takes the form of this huge this imperialism, capitalism, etc. But that's a different question. asking why do these market economies uniquely emerge in Europe is clearly wrong. They emerge elsewhere, and Europe is the latecomer. So all of that pretty much demolishes the 19th century thinkers, but of course it arguably makes Weber all the more intriguing. Not necessarily all the more right, but all the more intriguing. Because unlike a lot of the 19th century thinkers, who I think we would now say were just wrong, I mean, they just didn't know anything about the rest of the world and were obviously caught up in an imperial worldview that they didn't see the ideological implications of, Weber was nonetheless asking some intriguing questions that require revision, but they're all the more intriguing for that reason. And therefore, let us turn to Yu Ying-shih. Yu Ying-shih is one of the great 20th century Chinese intellectuals who devoted his career to trying to rethink the entirety of the intellectual and cultural history of China from the beginnings right through the present day. And the present day was for much of the 20th century. Yu Ying-shih passed away only a few years ago. So it really includes everything that we have been talking about. And Yu Ying-shih saw as his project really rethinking from the point of view of the 20th century all of these narratives that had become so embedded in Western social sciences, Western visions of history, and arguing if you take China seriously, you need to rethink all of them. And needless to say, one of the ones he thought needed desperate rethinking was this whole argument about the unique development of capitalism. But Yu Ying-shih also thought that at least for all of the critiques we'll see he's going to make of Weber, at least Weber posed for Yu Ying-shih an incredibly important question, which is, along with all of our historical work about the emergence of market economies, global trade networks, etc., Weber was also asking culturally, what were the religious and philosophical worldviews as well as the values that played a role in the emergence of at least market thinking, if not actual capitalism? And we'll come back to those terms momentarily. But was Weber onto something? If he's onto something for Europe, what is going on in China if Weber's reading of China was at a fundamental level wrong? But as Yu Ying-shih will say, Weber couldn't read Chinese. He was basing himself on 19th century writings on China, which from the European perspective are hardly convincing. So how do we rethink all of this? Was Weber right about Confucianism? We'll see. No, but why not? In other words, what did he get wrong? And how do we rethink all of these issues about values and culture and intellectual history if we really know China, which he most certainly does? And of course, how would this lead us to rethink the entire question of the global emergence of capitalism? So Yu Ying-shih will devote himself to, among many other projects, a rethinking of the entire Weberian framework. And let me begin in terms of this rethinking with the obvious place, namely his rethinking of Confucianism. So he will begin, he being Yu Ying-shih here, with a strong critique. Does Confucianism really think that we as individuals live in a cosmos that is already harmonious, and our goal is simply to live properly within it, helping to make a social order harmonious like the larger harmonious world, but that's it, with a strict limit because we believe in this, as Weber would call it, magico-religious worldview that the cosmos really is already harmonious. And Yu Ying-shih will say, no, that's simply wrong. It is certainly not a view that the world is simply there for our manipulation. Weber's quite right that that's not the view in Confucianism, but it also is not the case that there's this view that we are inherently part of a pre-given harmony. In fact, Yu Ying-shih will make a stronger statement, which is among Weber's complete misunderstandings is that he thinks there's one worldview called Confucianism that in fact was guiding people for these past 2,000 years. And Yu Ying-shih says, as a scholar of intellectual history, that's just wrong. Weber simply does not know this, and he doesn't even mean this is a critique of Weber. Weber had no access to this. He didn't know Chinese. He knew none of the requisite languages, but it is simply wrong. But nonetheless, if it's wrong, what is the right view? And at what point do we see, or do we see, I should pose as a question, anything remotely comparable to what Weber is saying occurred with Calvinism in Europe that also led to some kind of a support for market economy? Because it did exist. A market economy was massive and flourishing in the 16th through 18th centuries, with lots going on even before that. If that's the case, and it is, how? And along with all of the political, legal, and economic issues about which Yu Ying-shih is less immediately interested, what are the cultural values in play? So his argument goes along the following lines. Do you see something remotely comparable to Calvinism developing in China? And the answer is yes, but. Yes, in the sense that he will say there is a parallel development. It will be a strong but, because he does not think you see the kind of psychologically devastating sort of drive out of this bizarre theological position that Weber thinks is driving economic development in Europe. So, what is Yu Ying-shih's view? Yu Ying-shih will argue that, and like Weber, he loves the kind of counterintuitive sides of these narratives. And he will say, intriguingly, you begin to see the shift in some surprising places. So he begins his narrative not with Confucianism, but actually with Buddhism, which he will argue is early on in China a very otherworldly religion that focuses on cultivation, but ultimately aimed at work that would involve things other than social work here and now on the social plane. And hence, it tends to be otherworldly in terms of its ultimate interests. The argument is the beginning of the shift occurs with, of all things, Chan Buddhism. And with Chan Buddhism, you begin to see, Yu Ying-shih will argue, the beginnings of what he will call an inner worldly asceticism. Inner worldly asceticism meaning that the focus is on the actual work we must do internally to cultivate ourselves. However, it is inner worldly because that work can only be manifested if we are then acting in the world, and yet acting in the world without the attachments that would otherwise destroy our cultivation process. In a sense, then, it's too easy to simply remove ourselves from the social world, because if we're really doing inner cultivation, we would be involved in a social world without gaining attachment toward it, and hence truly developing the proper form of cultivation. And once this occurs, he will argue, you begin to see a common move being made, not just in Chan Buddhism, but in other religious traditions too. He will argue the same sort of shift begins happening in Taoism, and he will argue it begins to be picked up in, yes, Confucianism. And the big figure here, very ironically, for a genealogy of ideas that will be significant for the market economy, is going to be Zhu Xi, the figure who will later come to be seen, I should say, as the founder of what we now call Neo-Confucianism. And according to Yu Ying-shih, what Yu Ying-shih is doing is building on this inner worldly asceticism that he's picking up from, among other things, the Buddhist tradition as well as the Taoist tradition, but he's giving it a social ethic. He is saying, yes, we must, as Confucians, cultivate ourselves. And when we cultivate ourselves, it should be trying to become better human beings. It absolutely requires us to be involved in the social world. But in fact, the cultivation process, or I should say the degree to which our self-cultivation process is successful, is based upon the degree to which we are truly building a better social world. So it's an inner worldly asceticism aimed at building a better social world that can only work through things like education aimed at becoming a human being capable of sensing the world effectively, sensing the problems in the world, working to ameliorate those problems, and if one is going to engage in political activities, doing so in order to create a better political world. Such a worldview, he will say, will say, is not based on a pre-given inherent harmony. The notion would be, no. Those of us who are so cultivating themselves are creating a harmonious world, but we don't even have a pre-given sense of what that will mean. And there certainly is no sense that the world is already harmonious. The sense is we are training ourselves to see the world as requiring constant effort to make it a better place for human flourishing. So we are training ourselves to see, to give one of his examples, we will see the Tao, the way, as a sensibility of what a better world would be. It does not tell us, the Tao, what that better world would be. It just gives us a sense of the problems existing in this world that therefore, through our cultivation, we can begin to work on. And for Yu Ying-shih, this inner worldly asceticism, now aimed at a social ethic, is the key drive that begins the process of everything Weber was saying was good about China. But of course, note immediately from the way Yu Ying-shih is developing it, he is saying, but there's no sense of a pre-given harmony. There's no sense that the world is already harmonious. It's kind of the exact opposite. But note as well, there's no sense, in fact, very much the opposite sense, of Weber's description of a Calvinist worldview, of this endless work ethic for no purpose except the psychological prayer that it means you're part of the elect, leading to this disenchanted utilization of endless resources simply out of this work ethic. Rather, the sense is, no. You have a very clear social ethic that's guiding your work. Clear not because it will tell you what to do, but clear in the sense that you know where you're going. You're endlessly trying to see the problems in the world and endlessly trying to work on those problems. Now, this is the 12th century. And then Yu Ying-shih's narrative continues. The next set of stages over these next few centuries for Yu Ying-shih involves successive Confucians taking this basic view that's developing with figures like Yu Ying-shih and, in a sense, generalizing it. So a key figure for him is Wang Yangming, yet another very important Neo-Confucian thinker who for Yu Ying-shih takes the next step of saying, well, everything Yu Ying-shih is talking about is true, but de facto he's still limiting it to an incredibly small elite of people who really can spend decades educating themselves in these incredibly complex readings of the classical tradition, which means very few people could ever achieve this. And if we are understanding the Tao as a sensibility of how you would build a better world, why would this not be available to anyone, even if you're not learning it through a traditional curriculum of texts? And for Wang Yangming, if this is based in a social ethic of how we live our lives, why could we not be cultivating ourselves in our ordinary lives precisely to do everything Jushi is claiming, even if we are not going to be educated through the classics. And Wang Yangming will say, this is absolutely possible. And then the narrative will continue, where Weber will say, what begins occurring in the 16th through 18th centuries with the emergence of these huge market economies in China is you get a further generalization where you get merchants taking on this very view. And he will give tons of examples of merchants picking up on this exact language, saying the key is we are cultivating ourselves to gain an understanding of things like sincerity and proper understandings of social order in order to begin to build a better world, literally using the same language that a Yu Ying-shih will say we can trace clearly back to Wang Yangming and, in a different way, even back to a Jushi. Now, in other words, being generalized into the economic world. And he will then, Yu Ying-shih, will then go the next step. Do you see anything driving this in the merchant culture of the 16th through 18th centuries that is in any manner, shape, or form comparable to this incredibly psychologically devastating world of Calvinism that Weber describes in such a horrifying sense? This constant sense that since we don't know if we're part of the elect, we must endlessly work to be part of the elect, even though working won't help us get there. Is there anything like the psychological drive? And Yu Ying-shih will say, yes, but it's not so psychologically devastating. And he will say, Yu Ying-shih again, will say, what you see that's comparable, that will kind of give this push is, and he will trace this back to very early in the Chinese tradition, a drive toward what he will call social immortality, by which he will say you absolutely get a drive toward the idea that the work I do will leave a trace, either because it will be so significant my name will be remembered, or because I will build such a successful lineage that my lineage will remember me, and I will be given ancestral support, etc., posthumously, or that I will become so significant in my achievements that I will come to be seen, if not as a sage, at least as a great figure who created something significant. And all of these for Yu Ying-shih are a part of a drive to say, yes, I want to do well in the world, but part of the drive is beyond just doing well, I want to have some kind of social immortality. So my name or my work or my achievements or my accomplishments will continue. And his examples will be things like where merchants will talk about the formation of a business very much like a beginner of a dynasty will talk about the formation of a dynasty, where figures will talk about creating a new field very much like sages will be described as creating new institutions and new innovations, where business communities will be spoken of in directly lineage terms. So I'm the founder of a new lineage, for example. And Yu Ying-shih's point here is to say, in all of these examples, you get a drive that's sort of pushing this amazing amount of work, but note, it is not a drive with anything like the kind of psychological devastation that a Weber is describing for Calvinism, or Calvinism in its secularized form, leading to capitalism. Meaning the following. For Yu Ying-shih, do you have values that play a role in the emergence of a merchant economy? The answer is absolutely yes. It is this generalized form of a certain type of Confucianism, itself coming out of certain elements of earlier religious worldviews, practices, I should say, from Buddhism and Taoism, generalized into a broad-based business culture, absolutely creating all of the drive Weber will talk about. But without the kind of psychological devastation, and certainly without the kind of iron cage danger that Weber so powerfully described for what was going on in early 20th century Europe. Meaning that, in essence, what Yu Ying-shih is saying is, well, Weber is right and wrong. Weber is absolutely wrong that there was some Chinese worldview that held back the emergence of merchant activity. Absolutely wrong. At the same time, do you find in China, yes, values that lead to the emergence of a business culture, but values that are not the kind of devastating visions that Weber thinks will become an inherent part of the Western form of capitalism and all that it entails in terms of that drive, both psychologically and in terms of the larger world. And Yu Ying-shih there wants to say, yes, it's parallel, and yet you get something incredibly powerful. Certainly, Yu Ying-shih will never use a word like better, absolutely. But I think he is implicitly saying the choice is not, as Weber was posing it, rational worldview or something better, but we can't accept it because it's irrational. What Yu Ying-shih wants to say is, no, it is possible from a global perspective to have values that are part and parcel of an emergence of a merchant culture without the kind of drive that Weber is seeing correctly for the European side, which is also another way of saying, is it possible you could have a vibrant mercantile world without all of the things that Weber correctly, from Yu Ying-shih's perspective, sees as driving the European form of capitalist expansion? And if the answer is yes, as it most certainly is for Yu Ying-shih, the implication would be, again, it's not either or. Capitalism versus something better, but the better meaning we somehow get rid of capitalism, but no, what would that entail? And the argument of Yu Ying-shih is, no, what really happens if you take a larger global perspective that Weber was taking the first steps toward doing, but he didn't have the languages to really do it fully when he got out of the European context. But if you do, it allows you to see there are all sorts of different forms of cultures of capitalism, cultures of merchant activity, and in those worlds, there are other possibilities that Weber was correctly seeing are foreclosed in the kind of iron cage he was so brilliantly describing, but they need not be foreclosed if you really take a larger global perspective. In short, what Yu Ying-shih is trying to argue is that Weber was right to take that larger global perspective. He was right to think that values and culture matter, ideas matter. He simply was horrifyingly wrong in terms of his understanding of non-European worlds. But again, he had no access to them, apart from what he could gain through very bad secondary literature. But if we now do that project fully, as Yu Ying-shih is hoping to do for China, and by implication we should do for other worlds as well, the implication would be we would finally begin to live up to the implications of Weber's worldview, even though it would completely destroy it in a hopefully good way, by saying globally, let us rethink all of these ideas about capitalism, about an iron cage, about all of the assumptions we make about capitalism as being inherently part of this Western worldview, in realizing, no, there are many cultures of capitalism, and by implication, many, many, many more possibilities for the human world than a figure like Weber allowed himself to realize. But once we realize them, suddenly those possibilities become extraordinary, and possibilities of living outside the iron cage become, at least hopefully, a possible reality as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Puett. This is a fascinating and very inspiring lecture. As we previously discussed, I would like to provide a very, very short Chinese translation. Professor Puett 刚才讲的就是普鸣教授刚才讲的那个内容可以分成4个部分。第一部分就是从19世纪的时候，欧洲人一般会假设那个资本主义的发展是一个自然的过程，而且是只有欧洲才独有的过程。那么第二部分，普鸣教授就指出，韦伯是批评这种的这个欧洲人的这种观念，他指出资本主义并不是自然的，也不是说只有欧洲独有的。那么然后他就开始讨论那个资本主义在欧洲发展的过程。既然并不是自然发生的，也不是独有的，那么有什么因素促成这个欧洲资本主义的发展的出现呢？那韦伯的答案就是找到了这个基督教新教里面的加尔文的教派。那么加尔文教派的一些教义导致到出现一种就是加尔文教徒出现一种很独特的焦虑，就是他不知道自己会不会得到拯救。那么既然如此呢，就要全力的去工作，疯狂的工作，来这个让自己相信自己会得到救赎这样。那么对于韦伯来说，一个 big other 一个另类就是中国。那么中国有很多的这个在他眼中达到了理性化的这个程度，比如说很早就有一个很成熟的官僚，一个世俗化的宗教就是儒学。那么为什么到后来却发展不出这个资本主义呢？那么韦伯的那个判断就是说，因为中国的到了最后还是保持一种就是传统的就是传统的一种世界观，就是这个世界并不是可以拿来好像资本主义的教义这样可以拿来这个作为人类自己去享用去开发的。有这种的世界观这样。那么余英时教授的这个对于韦伯教授的韦伯的这个商榷，就是说韦伯有他对的一方，也有他错的一方。他错的地方是他对于这个中国并不了解，这也不是韦伯的问题，因为韦伯自己并不掌握中文，而他当时能够掌握到的有关中国的材料都是这个翻译成欧洲语文的而且并不太准确的材料。但是韦伯问对了一个问题，就是韦伯把这个资本主义的出现放在一个 global history， 就是一个全球史和一个比较史的网络里面去，并且呢，韦伯是指出文化和宗教是重要的，这些因素是对于这个资本主义的发生是重要的。那么余英时继续提出，比如说中国的这个理学，就是朱熹提出的理学和12世纪初期的理学和16世纪王阳明的这个王学或者心学，他们都这个产生了一种类似这个加尔文教派的那种工作的狂热，但是却没有那种的焦虑感。所以在这种的情况之下，我们可以看到有类似的一种精神的活动。所以到了最后要问的问题就并不是 either or， 不是说非此即彼，而是要问的问题是要比较的要追求的问题是如何，就是那个资本主义在每一个文明里面的那个发展是怎么样的。然后我们要回答这个问题的话，那就要做一个全球史的比较史的一个比较。那我希望我的这个翻译这个不是太错误啊。好。然后我们现在就这个看看有没有朋友这个提出问题。You may ask in English or in 普通话 or in Cantonese. I'll provide the translation if you ask in 普通话 or Cantonese.
And let me say, your summary was far better than my talk itself. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Do you think Chinese Confucianism compared to like Calvinism, there's a difference, and it won't eventually develop the market capitalism like the Europeans has done. So once it developed to a certain stage, there will be a cultural conflict. Do you agree with this kind of thinking or argument? That's my question.
Yes, it's a wonderful question. And Ying-shih actually does touch on this very directly. And he has some, I think, powerful answers. So he himself, of course, is looking mainly at the development of these ideas in the Chinese tradition and then using that to critique Western understandings, including, in this case, Weber. But he does explicitly pose your question, too, of saying, well, would the implication of this be that, for example, you have Asian societies based upon Confucian values and Western societies based upon, if not Calvinism, at least broadly speaking, Christian values? And would you get the world divided into these different cultural areas with no ability to communicate? And there's even a famous scientist, social scientist named Samuel Huntington, who was literally arguing that position. So he literally said, there's a Confucian world, an Islamic world, a Christian world, and the entire world is becoming divided between these, and there's no possibility of communication. And Yu Ying-shih would argue, and I would certainly agree with him as well, that need not occur at all. And in fact, if it does occur, it would be a result of taking particular elements from these traditions and building them into these static, untouchable ideologies. And for Yu Ying-shih, this would destroy their power. So for Yu Ying-shih, even the term Confucianism is a bit dangerous, because for Yu Ying-shih, does the sets of ideas he's talking about come out of, among other things, the Confucian tradition, but also the Buddhist and Taoist traditions? Yes, but he thinks this is a living tradition. Like, what's going on, in his opinion, in the 18th century is very different from what Jushi was thinking about, even though he thinks you can trace the genealogy very clearly, and this is quite different from earlier Confucianism too. So for him, all of these ideas and values only work if they are constantly being rethought, constantly changing, and part of that change means in dialogue with other ideas. So Jushi for Ying-shih is very much building his ideas coming out of Buddhism and Taoism. By implication, Yu Ying-shih would say, in the 20th century, we absolutely are going to be in dialogue with ideas from elsewhere in the world, certainly including from the West, given the way the world has played out, world history has played out for the past 2 centuries, and that will continue. So Yu Ying-shih would say, the more dialogue, growth, rethinking of traditions, the better, which also means there's not a single tradition. There's a tradition, so Jushi only has access to Buddhism. Now, in the 21st century, we have access to many more ideas in the world culture. And the more we're learning from each other and rethinking the world accordingly, the better. And I personally would say he's absolutely right about that. So if we want to take ideas and values seriously, and I certainly agree with him that we should, ideas and values are always being rethought. They're changing. They're being rethought in dialogue with others. The more of that that's going on, I would say the better. And I think Yu Ying-shih is absolutely right to emphasize that. So thank you. This is a perfect question. Thank you.
Okay, to answer to that.
Yes.
Question answer my question at least. But anyway, I would like to take this opportunity to ask a related question.
Please.
As far as we know, China has revived the importance of Confucianism in 1980. Yu Ying-shih in the beginning was very enthusiastic about the new development in China after the downfall of the fourth.
Yes.
However, he was very disappointed, and more importantly, he seemed to refuse or miss the importance or the meaning of the revival of Confucianism in China. So his ideas, his comments, his or even criticism of what the Chinese government or the Chinese communists were doing in China before he died,
right,
was sometimes a little bit too subjective or partial. What do you think?
Yeah, no, wonderful question. And you're absolutely right. So let me just underline the points you've made. So Yu Ying-shih absolutely had a very, and I think I'll use your word, a very skeptical view of the emergence of new forms of Confucianism in the 20th century, which may indeed sound odd from what I've described, because he very much saw himself as building out of a Confucian tradition. But I think the reason for this is Yu Ying-shih's concern was always that any time any set of ideas, including Confucians, is made into a single static ideology, going back to the earlier question as well, that's always going to be dangerous. So for him, the power of any tradition, most certainly including the Confucian tradition, is its constant changing. And I think he would even go the next step, that what really animates the Confucian tradition at its most powerful is that sense of what he will call the constant tension of lived reality with the Tao. And the Tao, again, for him, doesn't tell you how to build a better world. It just gives you a sense that the world can always be made better. So it kind of creates this drive to making it better, which gets back to the heart of your question, that he was always concerned with anything that, at least in his opinion, correctly or not, would limit that tension. So anytime you get an ideology developing that sort of pre-answers too many questions, he gets a little hesitant. And so I think that's what was going on in his critique of New Confucianism. Again, whether he's right or not, but his critique was that New Confucianism had the danger of building an ideology of Confucianism, of building an ideology, for example, kind of like what Weber would describe, that it was building an ideology of saying the world is harmonious and we are building a proper world in harmony with the larger harmonious natural world. And Weber's move here was to say, well, but be careful, because all of these notions of harmony in the tradition work because the sense is, no, the world isn't harmonious, and we're constantly having that drive to make it better. So regardless of whether we would agree with him politically or not, I think that was what was going on with his critique. He's just concerned anytime you see the creation of a clear ideology, and he's always concerned with ideologies. Like he wants these traditions to be ever changing, to be based upon the sense of constant tension with the lived world that we are in. And that's what drives the work to make the world better. So yeah, thank you. I think it does touch the heart of what drove him as a scholar. So yeah, thank you so much.
Any question?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I have a question about the approaches to comparative history itself.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe take Yu Ying-shih as an example. So in his latest and last book about the origin of ancient China thought, that he used and repeat the argument and concept about internal or inward transcendence again. So from the thousands years of Chinese history, he used the maybe same concept to generalize it. So maybe in his book about the, you just talk about the, the Confucian ethics and the capitalism spirit. He will criticize about the Weber feel that misinterpret and misunderstanding the Confucianism. But if we his view also in some sense generalize or give a holistic approach to the Confucianism. So is this generalizing is the assumption of the comparative history? Yeah, if this is the assumption of the comparative history, how will the school of comparative history to respond about the critique from such as pro-modernist for Michel Foucault or so on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And you're absolutely right. So one of Ying-shih's concerns in terms of comparative history is that scholars, and this also goes back to the earlier question too, scholars had a tendency to try to think of civilizations in terms of worldviews. And so in China, the notion would be, and Weber very much is an example of this, that in China you have a worldview of a harmonious cosmos that people just believed they lived within and would work within, but couldn't really change. And the idea would be that worldview is present throughout Chinese history. And so you read Chinese history as what happens when, for 2,000 years, people have that view, as opposed to a Christian view, an Islamic view, etc. And Ying-shih is very critical of this form of comparative history. And very much as you said, what he wants to say on the contrary is, let's do comparative history by looking at the tensions that are driving actions that are taken. So for Confucianism, exactly as you said, he will in one of his last books say, well, people talk about this Chinese worldview of harmony, but actually, if you look at the key moment when these ideas develop, which for him is the Warring States period, figures like, of course, Confucius, Mencius, etc. Zhuangzi is another big example for him. He will say, actually, what's going on, and this goes back to the earlier two questions too, is the development of this tension between, again, lived reality and the Tao. And different people, including the three I just mentioned, will conceptualize this radically differently. And those radical differences only grow over the course of the subsequent 2,000 years. And yet he wants to say, if we see that tension is what is driving the tradition, then we can begin to work out the different ways, different figures in specific moments saw that tension playing out and responding to it. So going back to the examples we were mentioning in the lecture, the reason that Zhu Xi, from this point of view, is developing Confucianism in the way he does is because he's living in a different time than earlier Confucians, but he sees that, or sees is the wrong verb, he feels that tension. And because he feels that tension, he is responding to his situation in ways that open up other possibilities that a Wang Yangming will then build upon, etc. And I might add for him, people also make bad decisions. So he thinks part of the way to understand the tradition is when people don't respond well. And he certainly thinks intellectual traditions involve lots of mistakes and people not responding well. And we, the latter born, can learn from that by seeing how people responded, why they did so effectively, why they failed to do so, how we, coming later, can therefore try to build on possibilities that either they opened up or that were foreclosed by poor decisions. And for him, this is what animates a tradition, which means, getting back to the heart of your question, it should equally animate a comparative history too, because then we're asking, comparatively speaking, what happens when traditions develop certain ways, other traditions develop other ways, what can we learn from those differences, what can we learn from the surprising parallels, now that they are potentially in dialogue, how can that dialogue occur? And for him, all of this becomes possible only if we don't think in terms of worldviews, but rather think in terms of these complex tensions and the way people are responding to situations. So I think you're exactly right. Part of what is so exciting about his work is I think he's really pointing toward a very different approach to comparative intellectual history than had really been dominant up until his day. And that's part of why it's so exciting to both work through and for us now to think through what it would mean going forward. So thank you so much. Wonderful question. Thank you.
We have a lot of friends joining us online, and one of the audience has this question to ask. Calvinism and Confucianism, two very different ideology. One is strictly religious. The other is loosely religious.
Yes.
So is it? Do you find any problem comparing these two elements?
Yeah, great question. And yes and no. And the reason I answer with that odd way is that part of what Weber's trying to do with his reading of Calvinism, and is part of the rhetorical power of that work, is he's saying, well, we tend to think of the modern world as simply a secularization of an earlier religious worldview. And Weber wants to say that is absolutely right, but it is a secularization that occurs for specific reasons. It is this disenchantment of the world. And that's not simply because we no longer have religion. It's actually occurring because the key religious worldview in this case, he will argue, Calvinism, drives this bizarre disenchantment out of this psychologically devastating sensibility it will create in us. So for him, yes, Calvinism absolutely is a religious worldview, but it pushes toward a certain type of secularization. And I answer your question that way because, yes, I think what Yu Ying-shih wants to say is, well, if you look at Confucianism, certainly it's not a religion in the way we would normally use that word. You could call it secular, but that really isn't accurate either. I mean, Confucians are intimately concerned with the Tao. And is that religious? Probably not. Is it secular? Well, depends on your definition. But most importantly, it kind of pushes against the Weberian distinction altogether, right? So Confucianism, as Yu Ying-shih is describing it, is based on this tension of working on lived reality, altering the world we're in precisely with appeals to something better, but without any sense of what that clear better is going to be. And that's the drive, which means it's not quite religious, but it's not purely secular either. And therefore, I think at least for Yu Ying-shih, he would say it kind of pushes against Weber's distinctions. So for Weber, that's part of the modern world, is it's purely secular. Is Confucianism purely secular? Well, by Weber's definition, not quite, but it's not also, as you said, religious either. And I think for Yu Ying-shih, that's great. The fact that for Yu Ying-shih, you're seeing things going on in the Chinese tradition that break down a lot of our standard categories that we've inherited from the Western tradition in the social sciences, he would say is good. And I would underline that point. I think Yu Ying-shih is right that opens up part of what's intriguing in doing comparative intellectual history, because it helps us see the degree to which our categories really have been based almost exclusively on 19th century Western ideas. And if we take ideas that emerge from China seriously, it helps us see the limitations of those categories and, again, opens up other possibilities. So thank you. Wonderful question.
Thanks so much for your talk, Dr. Puett. I have a two-part question. One is, so does Yu Ying-shih have anything to say about the dangers of a work ethic, whether or not it's irrational like a Calvinist one, the accumulationism, the harm to the environment, the gap between rich and poor that come with that work ethic? It seems it's far from something that's always desirable, even if it's not a Calvinist one. Does he have anything to say about that? And then on a larger scale, with this healthy deconstruction of the teleological narrative of capitalism that we have now, does Yu Ying-shih have anything to say about this notion that's very prevalent in Chinese culture of luohou, that China fell behind the West? You know, does he deconstruct that in any way?
Yeah, both are wonderful questions. And actually, let me begin with the first, which will lead directly to the second. So in terms of the first, yes, I actually think part of what Yu Ying-shih wants to say, it's not completely explicit, and yet I think between the lines, he's really getting at precisely what you're asking. And he wants to say, part of what's so dangerous about the Western form of capitalism is exactly as you said, it comes out of this drive. And I think Yu Ying-shih thinks Weber's onto something to say, if it's not literally coming out of Calvinism, it comes out of the psychologically just bizarre sensibility of, as you said, this incredible drive with no limits. So the natural world can be destroyed. You get this, as you said, radical divide between the rich and the poor. And yet, instead of like stopping or rethinking, there seems to be just this endless drive toward ever more and ever more. And I think Yu Ying-shih wants to say, Weber's onto something, whether it literally comes from Calvinism or not. At least Weber's onto something and saying something is going on there in terms of values that lead to this very, very dangerous approach to the world. And I do think Yu Ying-shih wants to say, yeah, you see values emerging in China equally very productive for the development of a market economy, and yet, and certainly involving incredible work ethic, obviously incredible focus on education and the importance of constant work for improvement. And yet, I use that word for the obvious reason, which is it's improvement. There is a sense that we are trying to create a better world, which also means you build in the possibility of saying, if the drive is so completely destructive, should we rethink our values? Should we rethink things? And I think Yu Ying-shih wants to say there's more of a possibility of that coming in the traditions he's looking at than there is coming out of, as Weber would describe it, this Calvinistic worldview in a secularized form of just an endless drive with no possible sense of limits. So again, he'll never quite say this is better. I do think he kind of between the lines wants to say, even if we don't want to use the word better, at least it opens up possibilities. And I think one of the possibilities he would say is exactly this. It gives us a much better possibility of sensing the dangers of what we are doing and allowing the possibility of rethinking it, something that sadly seems to be so bizarrely difficult if you look at the Euro-American expansion of the past 2 centuries. So I think he would say yes. And that intriguing leads directly to your second question too. Yes, he does. But what's intriguing is Yu Ying-shih wants to say, instead of asking why does capitalism not emerge in China, in his example, or anywhere outside of the West, he wants to say, well, maybe capitalism in the particular form it takes in 19th century Europe is just that. It's a particular form of merchant economy that emerges for, in part, the reasons Weber mentions, and that if we're thinking of merchant economies in general, they can develop in lots of different ways with different values, which would mean different practices. And I think he wants to say, well, look at the 16th to 18th centuries. You have a vibrant merchant economy in China. Why does that get stopped? It gets stopped because of imperialism, not, he wants to say, because of some Chinese worldview. Then it's allowed to begin again. But no, it would not be, and I think he means this in a good sense, the same as what's going on in 19th century Europe. But for him, wonderful. And the more that occurs globally, building on different values with different values, hopefully being ones we can learn from and be in dialogue with, the better. So put that way, getting back to the heart of your question, is it really that China developed late? Or is it rather that China was developing in a somewhat parallel but also distinctive path, and that was broken up? But now you're seeing the possibility of returning to some of those possibilities that were there and that now can be played out anew. And could we, in fact, generalize that to the entire world economy? So we're no longer thinking of capitalism as in being or merchant economies as being exclusively the form they took in Euro-America in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think he may well be onto something there. So thank you. Both of those questions are outstanding. Thank you.
Sorry, because of the time limits, I'm afraid we could only allow for one more question. Yes, I think the person behind, sorry.
Hi, Professor Puett. Thank you for your talk. I am a sociology student at the Chinese University, and my question is generally about how to conceptualize idea as social forces.
Yes.
So Yu Ying-shih has proposed this category of institutionalized versus suppressed Confucianism, especially like in response to our modern political criticism about Confucianism or tradition is the thing to blame for all like China's backwardness and so on. And by this category, he seems to be indicating that there is this authentic traditional value that is conveyed or maybe distorted by the official political forces, versus there may be a more authentic version preserved in some grassroots or dissent groups. So my question is that to what extent do you think this category work, and especially in light of today's context? Well, we already have this radical break from the past, like have this radical like iconoclastic view of the past as to blame for our like today's problems. Yeah, so I like to hear your view. Thank you.
Yes, wonderful question. And let me just underline it. I think you're exactly right. Yu Ying-shih over and over again will absolutely emphasize Confucians who were very much, as you said, kind of on the outside. They were always the critics. They're always the ones rethinking the social world. And very consistently, that's who he's looking at. I might add, intriguingly, it's a very different, not just we're discussing different worldview that a Weber would describe versus a Yu Ying-shih, but they're different figures too. Like Weber, again, is mainly, when he's talking about Confucians, he's thinking Confucian bureaucrats. Whereas you are precisely right, Yu Ying-shih really isn't. Yu Ying-shih his examples are almost without exception people who weren't part of the political process, or they were part of the political process, but as critics. They were always people on the outside, pushing against an established order. And that is absolutely what Yu Ying-shih liked. It's where he liked to think of himself as well. And I think you're right as well. It's worth asking. I mean, I think, and because of that, I should say, he's given a very, very powerful rereading of the Chinese tradition. That being said, that's possibly a limitation too, because what about the people who were in fact bureaucrats? And how do we think of the bureaucrats? How do we think of the figures who were trained in exactly the ways Yu Ying-shih was talking about, but did choose to take the civil service exam and did succeed and did become very effective bureaucrats? And it is true, Yu Ying-shih doesn't really spend a lot of time talking about them. He really likes the people on the sides, the critics, those who did not become civil servants. And I think you're right. Another question for us now to pose is to say, well, having learned so much from Yu Ying-shih's ideas of what ideas mean in practice and how ideas are part of a social reality and how individuals live and alter the world through the tensions they feel, couldn't we do the same for the bureaucrats that Weber was talking about? Realizing Weber was wrong, but could we not pose that same question and say, okay, but how were bureaucrats feeling these same tensions, and how were they wrestling with these same questions? And I think you're right. Part of the power of Yu Ying-shih is he wants to look at the outsiders, but you're right, by definition, that means there's a whole huge group of people he's not looking at. And as someone who also is very interested in the social history of ideas, I think you're right. Let's look at them too. Let's do a full sociology of ideas, which would include a sociology not just of people on the outside, not just of the merchants, all of which he's done a wonderful job with, but what about all of those people in positions of power? What about all of the people in temple networks? What about all of the people that don't quite fit his sense of the outside? How do we understand how they live their lives and how they worked out the tensions that the Yu Ying-shih gives us so powerfully, how they thought about how they're building a better world, or do they? I mean, how did they approach all the issues that Yu Ying-shih does so brilliantly? So yeah, I very much agree with the heart of where you're going with this. I think part of what we can learn from Yu Ying-shih is to say, well, can we learn from this approach and can we expand it and include the lives of people that he never really looked at, but that using his very approach, we could probably look at incredibly productively. So yeah, I think this is a very exciting vision of where we can go building upon his ideas. So thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Michael Puett, and thanks everyone for your participation. So we have our lecture ends here. I think our MC has something to announce, right?
Thank you again to Professor Puett and Professor Puett. The Yu Ying-shih Lecture in History 2023-2024 has now come to an end. We would like to thank you all once again for joining us this afternoon. You are welcome to scan the QR code on the back page of the lecture booklet and fill in the online opinion survey to share with us your views. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again next year.